Dear brothers and sisters, today I'm going to talk to you about death. It's a very difficult topic to talk about, but I've been thinking about death for a long time now, in the last 2-3 weeks since our loss of Brother Jamil Turk. As you realize, we have new fans in the Masjid. Last Ramadan, we had a situation where we had no air conditioning, and Brother Jamil went and brought these fans and left it with us the next day. Today is the first time we are using it, so may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give him ajr for the benefit he is providing all of us. I want to start by telling you a story about a man who sold horses. I've read many versions of this. I like the one where it says that he lived in Medina and he sold horses. One night he sees in a dream a man completely dressed in black come to him and tell him, Ya akhi, assalamu alaikum, I will see you in 7 days. Simple as just an ordinary dream, he didn't mean anything, he slept. The next day he sees the dream again, in which he sees the same man completely dressed in black come to him and say, Assalamu alaikum ya akhi, I will see you in 6 more days. So in the morning when he gets up, he's a little disturbed. I mean, he has had dreams before which are repetitive in nature, but he has never had a dream which is so mathematically accurate. I mean, in the second dream, the man makes an adjustment and says, I'll see you in 6 days. In the previous dream, he has said, I'll see you in 7 days. So he's a little worried. He's thinking about it all day while he's selling his horses, and then he goes to sleep. And he sees in the dream the same man completely dressed in black come to him and say, Ya assalamu alaikum ya akhi, I will see you in 5 days. Now when he gets up in the morning, he clearly is very disturbed by this dream, and he says, there's something going on here which is really very weird. So after he finishes selling his horses, he goes to the masjid and meets the imam, and the sheikh tells him that, I think that's Malik al-Maut, giving you advance warning in your dream. For some reason, maybe Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala likes you a lot, and He is asking you to prepare for death. You're going to die in 5 days. The man is a little suspicious and skeptical. He thinks that the imam is trying to get some money out of him, so he ignores the imam's advice, the sheikh's advice, goes back home and goes to sleep, and he sees this man in this dream again, who comes and says, Assalamu alaikum ya akhi, I'm coming to see you in 4 more days. Now he's total panic, and he gets up in the morning and says, this is too much. This is too accurate, too real. He's totally panicking, so he goes to see, obviously, a lawyer. And he says, what do I do? The lawyer says, well, what you need to do is you need to put your papers in order. You need to make sure that if you die, your property goes to your family, your children are taken care of, etc. So he transfers all his assets to his wife and his kids, etc., and he's preparing. But since he's a horse trader, he has lots of horses left. And he's also very skeptical. He doesn't think that he's going to die, but he says, if I die, I better prepare for it. So he starts preparing for it. And so he sees the dream again in the night, and the man dressed in completely black says, I'm seeing you in 3 days. And then he sees the dream and says, I'm seeing you in 2 more days. So when he gets up after the 2 more days, he decides that he's going to sell all his horses. And then he gets this idea, he says, why not leave town? So he decides that he'll sell all his horses and run away from Medina to Mecca. So this is his plan. He wants to sell all horses, keep 2 horses so he can switch horses, ride non-stop to Mecca. And he says, I'll go and hide in the haram and let us see what happens. So as he's selling, as the time goes around, he realizes that there's not much time left for him. And so finally he starts releasing the price. In the end, he's left with 4 of his best horses, 2 of which he wants to sell and 2 which he wants to retain so he can ride all night and reach Mecca the next day. Then he sees a man coming towards him who is completely dressed in black. And he says, are you selling horses? He says, yes. He says, I want 2 horses. So he says, yeah, you can pick any of these 2. These are my 4 best horses. So the man says, well, I'm in a hurry, so I'll pay you whatever price you want for these 2 horses. So the merchant says, it's such a coincidence, I'm also in a hurry. I was going to take whatever price you were going to offer. So he says, well, let's average it out. So he sells his 2 horses to this man dressed in black. He gets on the other 2 horses and starts riding towards Mecca very rapidly. Because now only 24 hours are left. As he's riding, he hears horses behind him, and he turns around and he sees the man in the black also riding rapidly. So he stops and says, "Where are you going?" He says, "I'm going to Mecca." He says, "Well, I'm also going to Mecca." He says, "What are you going to do in Mecca?" He said, "I'm going to Haram." So the man in the black says, "I'm also going to the Haram, and I have an appointment there tomorrow with a man who sells horses. That's why I bought your horse." Well, this story is essentially the tafsir of an ayah in the Quran. And the ayah in the Quran says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, أَيْنَمَا تَكُونُوا يُدَرِّكُمُ الْمَوْتِ وَلَوْ كُنْتُمْ فِي بُرُوجٍ مُشَيَّدَةٍ. What it says is that wherever you may be, death will overtake you. Even if you go and hide in lofty towers. I mean, this story is so ironical. This man is actually selling the person who's coming to take his life the means to it, to catch up with him in Mecca. Now, this is a very profound verse in the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying there is no escape from death. You cannot run away from death. In fact, life, what we are doing in life is actually running towards our death. You know, people don't seem to understand that when we are born, we think that we are living our life. But the moment we are born, we start dying. The moment we are born, we start dying. Some people take 75 years to die, some take 80, some take 30, some take 40 years. But the life is a process of time. And it is a very important thing for us to understand that death is something very different from what we normally think. First of all, not many of us are used to thinking about death. I don't know how often you have actually taken time out or sat in a conversation contemplating death. We don't even have a complete biological and physical idea of what death really means. And from then to have a psychological and a religious and a spiritual understanding of death is also very difficult. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Kullu nafsin za'iqatul maut, saying that every soul, every person, every being will taste death, will taste death. Kullu nafsin za'iqatul maut, wa innama tuwaffayna ujurakum yawm al-qiyamah. And it is like the day of judgment where whatever you have achieved and done in this world, you will be accounted for. فَمَنْ ذُهْزِيَ عَنِ النَّارِ وَأُدْخُلَ الْجَنَّةَ فَقَدْ فَازَ. Those who have escaped the hellfire and entered heaven, they have indeed won a great victory. But then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَا الْحَيَاةُ الدُّنْيَا إِلَّا مَتَاعُ الْغُرُورِ. He's saying, but what is life of this world? What is life of this world? وَمَا الْحَيَاةُ الدُّنْيَا. He's saying that what is life of this world except the enjoyment of delusion. And that is very profound, I think, for Muslims to understand. That life in the Quran is described as an illusion. And it's not just illusion, but the pleasure of illusion, the enjoyment of illusion. So when we live, we are living in a state of delusion, which means that life is not real, and it is death that is real. It is death which is real and not life. Unfortunately, all of us live in the opposite sense, as if death is an unreal, remote possibility. Whereas life is so immediate and so profound and so real. So from this ayah, it is very interesting that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying life is nothing but an illusion. It is death which is reality. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also says in the Quran, and he repeats this, Kullu nafsin za'iqatul maut, every soul will taste death. وَنَبْلُكُمْ بِالشَّرِّ وَالْخَيْرِ فِتْنَةً. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created this life for us to test. But he also says, الَّذِينَ خَلَقَ الْمَوْتِ وَالْحَيَاةِ لِيَبْلُكُمْ أَيُّكُمْ أَحْسَنُ عَمَلًا. He says he has created life and death. And in this ayah he's saying death first. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, he is the one, خَلَقَ الْمَوْتِ وَالْحَيَاةِ. He has created death and life to test us and to see which one of us does beautiful things in our life. So the purpose of life and death are identical. It is to test us. And He tests us with khair, and He also tests us with bad things. But to me, one of the most profoundest things that I at least understand from this ayah is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also created death. So it's an assertive, positive statement. It's not as if, it's like saying that life is something that is created, all these human beings, life, etc. When you turn it off, that is death. But that's not what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not saying that death is absence of life. What He is saying is that death is also a creation. In the sense, if Allah had not created death, we would not die. If He had not created death, we would not die. And so, if you think of it, then death becomes two things. One, it becomes a process. And the second thing is that it becomes an event. So life is the process of death. And the moment of death is the event of death. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us to prepare for both. Prepare for the event of death and prepare for the process of death. The way you prepare for the process of death is by understanding why God created life, which is to see what kind of beautiful things we can do. What is the ihsan that we can bring in this life? What ihsan we can do in this life, that is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is keeping score of the beautiful things that you can possibly do in this life. And the event of death is where you prepare for that, you arrange for your grave, you arrange for the worldly affairs of your family, etc. So understand these two things. We are often focused on the event of death, but not on the process of death. We live life as if we are immortal. And it is from this illusion and this assumption of immortality that we draw meaning. For example, if I was trying to sell you a car, and you ask me, how long will this car last? And I say it will last longer than your life, you are probably willing to pay a lot of money. A lot of people buy German cars because they are durable. They have long life, they have resale value, etc. You're thinking in future. But if I told you, I don't know, it could go kaput tomorrow, are you going to pay anything for that car? If I'm selling you a car and say, I don't know, it could stop now, it could stop 100 years later. Life is like that. If you realize that life is going to end tomorrow or any time now, you will not attach much value to it. It is only the assumption of immortality which allows us to value life and things that are meaningful. We sit and plan for the next 30, 40 years. You know, one of the last conversations that I had with Brother Jamil was the elections of 2018, where we were trying to pick a district from which he could run for election in the state of Delaware. So we were looking at the map and saying maybe you should run from here, which would entail him moving, looking at his residency, etc. We were planning for 2018, that was pointless. Now that entire conversation sounds so meaningless because life itself did not last for that. So how do you cope with this new philosophical assumption that life is something that can end any time? And that's where you have to value. There's a French philosopher called Jean-Paul Sartre who wrote a story called The Wall. If you ever get a chance, read it. Some of the old versions are available free on the internet. In that story, he talks about a man. I'm going to give you a very brief version of it. He talks about a man who is sentenced to death. And he's told at 11 o'clock in the night that at 5 o'clock he will be shot and killed in front of the wall. So the man is awake all night and he spends his night looking and evaluating his life. He's shocked. He loved his life very much. He had a fiancé, he loved his fiancé, he loved his job, he loved his politics, he loved his books, his house, etc. But as he knows that he has only 5 more hours to die, he starts evaluating the value of all the things that he loved. And he starts realizing that they have no value. with everything in his life that he starts, he says, oh, this is transient, this is not permanent, this will not last, this is meaningless, this has no sublime value, no spiritual value, and so on and so forth. So much so that he even discounts his values and his relatives and his fiancée, etc. So by 5 o'clock in the morning, when the guards come to take him to shoot him, there's nothing in his life that he values, and he thinks his life is useless and meaningless, I'm ready to die. But unfortunately for him, he's not killed. For some reason, he's let go. And now this man has nothing. He has life, but no value of life. From your faces, I can see that perhaps I'm not able to communicate that meaning of things in life comes from this assumption of immortality. And if we let go of this assumption that we are immortal, it will change the way we look at the things that we value in our life. It will change our priorities. For example, you could be at the moment allocating funds and saying, okay, I'm going to give $500 to the Masjid, I'm going to spend $50,000 on the pool in my backyard, where you're going to live another 20 years. However, if I told you that, well, you're going to die tomorrow morning, you might reverse the budget. You might change your order and say, okay, I'm going to spend $50,000 on the Masjid expansion and $500 just to call my friends and tell them bye. That's how life suddenly becomes meaningless once you realize that you are not immortal. The Prophet ﷺ told us many times to remember death. To remember death. He described death as the destroyer of pleasure. Today is the 12th of Shaban. Sunday night will be the 14th night of Shaban. In some cultures and countries, it's called Laylatul Bara, or as in India, Pakistan, we say Shab Barat. And it is celebrated in many ways, depending on what cultural background you come from. But one of the things, and one of the hadiths which is often narrated on this night, is to go to the graveyard. Go to the graveyard and pray for your elders who've already died. But the purpose of going to the graveyard is not just to send blessings and prayers on behalf of those who died, but to remember death. So every time you see a grave, every time you visit a graveyard, it reminds you of your mortality. It reminds you of your mortality, that one day you will be there too. And that is very important. I'm going to recite to you a Khutbah from Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, which actually addresses this exact situation. The Prophet ﷺ said, O people, it seems as if we are exempted from death. O people, it seems as if we are exempted from death, and as if truth in this life is dependent upon other than us. As if those dead people whom we escort to their graves are travelers who will return to us very soon. Which means even when we witness death, we are not understanding that. We lay them in their tombs and devour their inheritance as if we are immortal after them. So we bury these people and then enjoy the inheritance that we get from them as if we are immortal and they are not. We forget all injunctions and we feel secure from every tragedy. All goodness is to the person who is minding his own faults and is keeping away from others' faults. All goodness to the person who spends wealth which he acquired legally and mixes with the learned and wise men and mixes with the poor and the downtrodden. All goodness to the humble and the high-mannered and the good-hearted and the one who keeps his evil deeds away from people. All goodness to the person who spends his extra wealth and withholds his extra talk. I just love this. All goodness to the person who spends his extra wealth and withholds his extra talk and is satisfied with the sunnah and not attracted by heretical innovations. Alhamdulillah, salatu wassalamu ala Rasulullah. Dear brothers and sisters, in a very widely discussed, debated, in discussed hadith, the Prophet ﷺ says, "Yamutu qabla an tamutu." Please die before you die. He's asked us to die before you die. What does that mean, to die before you die? In order to understand how to die before we die, we need to understand what happens when you die. Death is not a finality. Death is like shifting gears. It's like if you're driving a hybrid, you're on gas and now you shift to electricity. That's like that. The Islamic conception of death is because all of us are composed of flesh and the soul is the breath of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it is eternal. So when we die, we just move from one world to another world. From the world that is known to a world which is unknown. So we are in transit, we're moving away. So when we die, that is one thing that happens. We move away from the worldly desires. Because with death comes the end of desire. It's not the soul that dies, but it is the human desire for material, corporeal things that dies. With death dies the desire for wealth. With death dies the desire for power, the desire for being known, the desire for being loved in this world. That is what dies with death. But what survives are two things. One is what you did in this world, your amal, and what you left behind. And two, your soul, which will be held accountable for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So in that sense, death in one way is, you have to understand, it's not a finality, it's not the end of things, it's the beginning of another thing, the beginning of another eternal project. It's like you just got off a station and took another train. It's like switching trains onto another destination. But what is also interesting is that with death comes clarity. We live in a world where, in spite of revelation, in spite of the Quran, in spite of the hikmah the Prophet ﷺ left behind, the Sunnah, Hadith, and all the scholars, there is confusion and lack of clarity, and Muslims and others disagree. We debate and we argue about the meaning of our religion, of the rules and laws, etc. But with that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has promised us in the Quran many times that He will clarify all the issues on which we disagree. So with that comes clarity. And of course with that comes the promise for those of us who have been fortunate enough to pursue good deeds, is to see the vision in the face of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So death is a reward in a sense. So death is something with which you get clarity, you get judgment. With death comes judgment, a judgment of everything that you have done in this life. With that comes understanding of true reality. If this world is a delusion, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, then with that will come an understanding of reality and divine connection. So when we say die before you die, what we need to do is to simulate all those things that come. Simplify your faith so that you have clarity. Prepare for judgment by sitting in judgment yourself upon yourself. Do muraqabah every night. Judge yourself. That is the way you prepare for judgment. Prepare to see the light by trying to do as much ihsan as possible. So the meaning of to die before you die is to try and simulate what we expect after that. And that is an important part of our faith. I'm going to end with one khutbah, a very brief khutbah from Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The fact that I can actually reproduce two of his sermons in one of my sermons tells you that how much we have departed from old traditions where the khutbah is to be brief. Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "O people, repent before you die, and embark upon good deeds before you become occupied, and connect what is between you and your Lord by remembering Him all the time. Indeed, you will be happy. Give much sadaqah, so you will be endowed by Allah, and bid good to others, so you protect yourself, and forbid evil unto others, so you will be victorious. O people, the smartest among you is the one who remembers the death the most." This is very important. Prophet ﷺ said, O people, the smartest among you is the one who remembers death the most, and the wisest among you is the one who is best ready for it. Indeed, among the signs of hikmah are shunning the falsehood of this life, turning towards eternal life, being fully equipped to live in the grave, and being ready for resurrection. This is the khutbah that Prophet ﷺ gave about death. I pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, رَبَّنَا أَتَيْنَا فِي الدُّنْيَا حَسْنَةً وَفِي الْآخِرَةِ وَحَسْنَةً وَقِنَا عَذَابَ النَّارِ. That in this life He gives us the ability to understand death as a process, and also help us and give us the wisdom and the strength to prepare for the death as an event itself. We have to understand that life is nothing but life and death, the two sides of the same coin. So we do not get so drunk by the illusion of life that we forget the reality of death and what it promises and what it holds for us. A good preparation for Ramadan, which is just around the corner. إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَعْمُرُ بِالْعَدْلِ وَالْإِحْسَانِ وَإِيتَاءِ الْقُرْبَى وَيَنْهَى عَنِ الْفَحْشَاءِ وَالْبَغْيِ يَعِظُكُمْ لَعَلَّكُمْ تَذَكَّرُونَ وَأَقِيمُوا الصَّلَاةَ.